you very much. Good morning to everybody. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, it's a pleasure for me to welcome you today for the second day of this very interesting and unprecedented conference, trying to connect GCC and the ASEAN region. I hope you've had a good introduction to what is required to make these connections happen yesterday, and as I was talking to somebody earlier, that a number of these things really happen after the actual formal session. So it's the networking that matters, and it's the conversations in the corridors and lunch and coffee breaks that really matter. So I hope you are taking advantage of those. We have a very full program today, and today we are going to delve deep into some of the key sectors where there are opportunities, for example, healthcare, energy, and so on. And then we have a most important session today about empowerment of women and philanthropy in business, and how can the two blocks really learn from each other. And we have a very interesting session, which I know a number of you are looking forward to attending. I've been asked to provide a global perspective on our discussion, both from yesterday and today, and anything that leads from this conference. So let me try to do that as quickly and as little time as possible. We know that the news about the global economy continues to be less than positive. We have the adjustments that are required to fix the banks and the financial sector in the United States, followed by the EU's issues that continue, and now we have the latest news of slowdown in China. So these things will continue. But then there's good news on the global economy as well. Over the last few years, we have seen the emergence of new growth poles. These are what we call in the World Bank South-South interactions, which is non-industrialized countries doing trade and other interactions with each other. These are quite significant, and they are growing very significantly, and they're basically growing as the middle class in all these countries start to come into their own and create opportunities, both internally and then externally. Let me give you a few numbers just to provide a good understanding of what we are talking about. Developing countries now account for 35% of all imports, global imports. And this used to be only 24% less than a decade ago. So from 24 to 35. Almost 60% of all FDI from developing countries now goes to other developing countries. This is quite significant because the share of FDI, the global FDI, the share from developing countries is already quite high. FDI has increased from the developing countries. The outflow, meaning investments going out of developing countries, used to be only 15% less than a decade ago of the total FDI in the world. It now accounts for 22. We estimate that by 2020, trade between developing countries will surpass trade between developed and developing countries. So these are very significant changes happening in the global economic order. And the growth poles that we are talking about are going to be driving not just growth in the current recession or driving us hopefully out of this recession, but they're going to sustain that growth going forward. And of course, as you all know, ASEAN, a lot of the story is explained by what is happening in ASEAN and its connections with other blocs, including the GCC. Let me give you a few numbers on where the GCC and ASEAN trade is. So GCC imports from ASEAN about 17.5 billion euros a year. GCC exports to ASEAN are about 44 billion euros. And GCC trade with ASEAN is roughly about 61 billion euros a year. This is good progress, but there's a long way to go. There's a lot of ground to cover for these two blocks to really come together. They're not only significant from a financial and economic standpoint, but as you all realize, geopolitically, these two regions mean a lot to the world. So the question for us is, what can we do to expand this cooperation between GCC and ASEAN? Let me put a few ideas on the table here. Some of these things were discussed yesterday, and hopefully they can be discussed today again in more detail. And then they may spark some ideas and may be part of other initiatives which follow from this conference. Let me first start off by noting that trade and FDI numbers are useful, but they're not enough to really fully comprehend the relationship between regions and blocks. It's sort of like friendship. You have good friends and you have very close friends, but you don't judge the closeness of your friendship by noting the number of times you see a friend. In fact, a number of our friends we don't see very often, who we are very close to. So when we think about regional blocks and regional cooperation, we need to be careful about not summing everything through numbers. There are a lot of soft things, a lot of things that don't show up on the numbers. For example, one of the ideas that was discussed yesterday is the concept of GCC and ASEAN players coming together, joining joint ventures and other arrangements to invest in third region. That is currently already happening, certainly in South Asia, but we see there a lot of possibility of that happening in Latin America and ultimately in Africa, which will sort of seems right now as the last frontier for economic growth, and it is growing very fast, as some of you might know. So we need to think about other forms, other models, arrangements whereby private sector firms from the GCC and ASEAN can come together to do business together and not limit ourselves to just trade numbers or FDI numbers. Second thing, to leverage capital from GCC, it's clear that ASEAN side needs to do some work. We talked about parking money as a metaphor for Gulf money coming in to ASEAN. Well, we need to have better parking spaces in ASEAN. We need to do some work both on the legislative and administrative side, but also in preparing transactions that the investors from Gulf would feel comfortable with. This involves, investment models, structures which investors from the Gulf can do due diligence on more comfortably, and they must involve some sort of government support to make the investors from the Gulf feel comfortable. So just saying, look, you have money, we have need is not good enough. You need to create vehicles for that money to come and find the investment. So a lot of work on the ASEAN side still needs to be done. And here, yesterday we heard Philippines presenting a model of annuities in PPPs, which seems like the right kind of, it seems at least like a good example of the kinds of investment models ASEAN needs to create. So the annuity model is basically, the private sector comes in, does something that they are required to do under the contract with the government, and the government then estimates a return on equity and guarantees that return on equity through the payments that it makes to the private sector. So the private sector is taking some operational risk, but a lot of the downside is capped away. Those types of engagements will be very, very useful for investors in the Gulf who may or may not know ASEAN very well, who may or may not be interested in taking very high risk. Even if the rewards are not as high, they may be more interested in slowly moving into the ASEAN region. So that was one model. There are many other types of arrangements that I think ASEAN will have to come up with, the governments in ASEAN, to attract this capital. Now, speaking of investment, we, in the GCC, the capital has always been there for 2-3 decades, as long as, since the 1980s. There's always been a lot of capital in GCC, and there's been a need to invest it properly. In the old days, the investment targets were typically North America, Europe, and so on. And so the investors from the Gulf, by and large, looked for investment managers who had that experience, who knew those markets, who came through those, the training in the West, who had proven themselves, and so people felt comfortable allowing them to manage their money. Now that the targets for investment have moved to East Asia, perhaps it may be advisable to have a rethink on that, to figure out who do you want to advise you on where to invest. Asia has changed a lot in the last decade. You can now very easily find the kinds of profiles that were not possible to identify in the old days. You have Asians who grew up in Asia, studied in the US or Europe, trained there, worked there, have proven themselves at the highest institutions, and are now coming back to Asia because of the opportunities. So, it may be advisable to think about who you work through when you look for opportunities in East Asia, and the old models of, a certain type of investment managers may or may not be the most useful ones in today's time. The other part about investing model from GCC is how you invest. So for a long time we have seen, with a few exception of the big sovereign wealth funds, by and large the investment approach from the GCC has been to identify specific opportunities, to look for deals. So, people come and shop around projects. Various different memorandas are shopped around to different principals. And I guess what I want to leave, the thought that I want to leave with you is, look, if you are thinking about ASEAN as the future, as the next step for global growth, and you want to be part of that, then perhaps it's worth it to think about investing in ASEAN in a long-term manner as well. Don't think about one deal at a time. Don't think about, if I see something, in a very opportunistic way, I will jump, otherwise I sit here. You want to build business, you want to establish collaborations with players in ASEAN, you need to be there for the long term. You need to open offices in ASEAN, you need to have partnerships that may or may not involve direct investments, but you need to learn, you need to think, you need to work with these people. And thus far we haven't seen that. So obviously that would create some opportunities for people who can consolidate, people who can make the connections, and that goes back to the point I made earlier, which is who you work with, how you work with, and the longevity of your presence in ASEAN is going to matter. Because remember, ASEAN is not just sitting there waiting for only GCC. So this is, there's global competition. There are other regions trying to do the same thing. I'll give you an example. We, just before I came last week, we organized a session in Singapore for the government of Mexico. So Mexico identified infrastructure deals under their new law. They've just issued a new PPP law, and they have a new pipeline of projects coming through, and they are very interested in making headway towards the east. So we organized this whole session for them where they had these 2 port transactions that were showcased. At the same time, they hired financial advisors in Singapore who know the East Asian market. And these advisors then identified 5 or 6 specific investors in East Asia from China, Indonesia, Singapore, and Hong Kong markets who are interested in those projects. So the morning was about discussion on what works in East Asia and what works in Mexico, but the afternoon was all one-on-one discussion on deals. And the idea is that when these projects go to market, they will issue RFPs in the next 6 months, that they hope to have East Asian investors involved. Now, I point this out as an example of other regions reaching out to take advantage of that platform in ASEAN. And so GCC will have to think about how to react to that and how to take an existing relationship and take it to the next level. Because nothing stays, as I was saying yesterday, nothing stays the same. You're either going up or you're going down. If you have a relationship, it's either getting better or it's getting worse, because the world is dynamic. If you're not going to do something, somebody else will. Now, last but not least, let me just also mention Islamic finance. We had a session yesterday, and we have discussions about Islamic finance a lot. All around the world. Islamic finance provides a fantastic platform for GCC and ASEAN connectivity. It's a good model. There's a story behind it. It makes sense for the GCC investors. Certainly the money is required on the ASEAN side. But let me tell you a little secret. People still don't know Islamic finance. They really don't. It's not the fault of Islamic finance. It's quite simple, but people, there are two or three reactions. One, just the Islamic part immediately puts them in a spin, and they assume things that they should not be assuming. Two, the people who have been moving Islamic finance forward have done a fantastic job. In fact, there are a number of pioneers of Islamic finance that we should be very thankful to. They have provided legitimacy to this field. They've established it. It's there. But I think it's now time for the next generation to take Islamic finance and mainstream it. And ASEAN is a fantastic region where you can do that. People are already positively predisposed to the Gulf and to Islamic finance, and people need the money. So there's a need for capital, there's an understanding at the philosophical level. If we can't establish Islamic finance in ASEAN, I think we'll have a hard time establishing Islamic finance in other regions. So it's a good first region where we should make a plan to demonstrate acceptance and mainstreaming of Islamic finance, and if we don't, I think it'll be an opportunity missed. So I will stop here with these points, and I hope that the discussions today take us further into details of how these ideas about connecting GCC and ASEAN can be put into practice. And I hope that amongst you are people who will connect with each other and explore options for how to do business together. At the end of the day, it's the business that matters, and speeches don't really make a difference. People have been making speeches about GCC and ASEAN collaboration for decades, and we are where we are. Where we are is not bad. We do have a lot to thank for. We do have a lot to show in terms of results, but if we are talking about global trade and we're talking about expanding this cooperation into something really tangible which will last the test of time, then we really need to take a few very concrete steps, and we need some showcase transactions to show how this works. I thank you once again for coming back today, and look forward to the conversations today. Thank you.